to attend and give evidence today, Ms Doe?
Yes, I did.
Do you have that summons there?
Yes, I do.
I tender that summons.
Exhibit 4.197 is the summons to Ms Doe.
Ms Doe, did you make a statement to the Royal Commission dated the 30th of June this year?
Yes, I did.
Do you have that statement there?
Yes, I do.
Are the contents of that statement true and correct?
Yes, they are.
I tender that statement, Commissioner.
Exhibit 4.198, the statement of Ms Doe, 30 June 18.
Ms Doe, you are a senior family support worker in Katherine.
I am.
Which organisation do you work for?
Or Save the Children.
And what does your position at Save the Children involve?
I work in a program called the Intensive Family Support Service. It services the Katherine town and a number of remote Indigenous communities around Katherine. My role as senior family support worker involves providing intensive case management and family-focused case management to families whose children may have previous or current involvement with the child protection system. So it's my role to provide education and support to build parental and carer capacity with a view to support families to enhance the safety and well-being of their children.
And where did you work prior to Save the Children, Ms Doe?
Prior to Save the Children, I was a family support worker with an organisation called Good Shepherd Australia New Zealand, and I was based in Melbourne then.
Don't mind, I might ask you to try and keep your voice up a little. Now, do you have qualifications,
It's usually
Ms Doe?
my line, that's all.
Yes, I do. I have a Bachelor of Social Work from RMIT University.
Now, in the statement that you've provided to the Commission, Ms Doe, you provide evidence about one of your clients at Save the Children.
Yes.
And could you tell us a bit about that client?
Yes, my client is a Dallabon woman. She lives in a remote Indigenous community approximately an hour and a half away from Katherine. She's in her 30s. She's a single mother of 3 school-aged children. She speaks 2 Aboriginal languages. She also speaks English, but English is not her first language.
Now, can I ask you a bit about the community in which your client lives? You said it was an hour and a half away from Katherine, is that right?
Yes.
Can you tell us a bit about the community, the size of the community and how it operates?
Sure. The community is about 100 kilometres or so away from Katherine. My understanding is that the population is around 400 to 500 people. The majority, if not all of the residents in that community would, I imagine, identify as Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander. My work involves driving out to that community a few times a week, depending on the needs of the client or the needs of the family. Yeah.
Are there times when the community is difficult to access from Katherine?
Yes, the drive to and from the community would really depend on the weather conditions and the season throughout the year. So during the wet season, for example, the conditions of the road might be such that it might take us longer to drive out there, or it might be unsafe for workers to drive on the conditions of that road, in which case we won't be able to go out to see the family. And very occasionally throughout the wet season, there might be flooding that occurs as well, which prevents us from going into the community, but also people leaving the community as well.
Is there any bank presence in the community, Ms Doe?
I don't believe there's a bank branch in the community. I believe there is one ATM in the community.
And what do you know about that ATM, Ms Doe?
My understanding is that that ATM is privately operated, which means that each time my client would check her balance at that ATM or try to withdraw money, she would be charged a fee.
And do the residents of this community have the ability to access the internet?
I believe there is mobile phone coverage and there is internet coverage, yes.
Do you know how, other than a mobile phone coverage, internet access is, there is internet access in the community? How does that operate?
I believe there is a communal computer available at the local council office that people might be able to access if they need to.
Can I come back to your client, Ms Doe? Do you know what your client's source of income is?
Her main source of income is Centrelink payments.
And does your client have a basic card?
I believe she does.
And can you explain what, we've heard a bit about basic accounts, and I'm going to ask you some questions about those later. That's different to a basic card, is that right?
Sorry, what's different from a basic card?
Is a basic account something different to a basic card?
My understanding is the basic card is associated with her Centrelink payments, so I would be able to speak to the basic card.
Is the basic card a form of income management?
Yes,
is that
it is.
how that works?
I believe it is, yes.
So how does it operate? Do you know that?
My understanding is that my clients, 50% of my clients' Centrelink payments are allocated towards her basic card, which means that there are particular transactions or goods and services that she would not be able to access with the money on that basic card.
Okay, so 50% of her benefits are put onto the basic card, and only certain essential goods and services can be acquired with money on that card, is
That's
that right?
my understanding, yes.
And then 50% remains in your client's account for her to access as she wishes?
Yes.
Okay. Now, did your client, I'm going to ask you about some engagement that you had with your client from November last year, but to your knowledge, at the time you started engaging with your client, did she have direct debits in the bank account that she operated at that time?
I believe she did, yes.
And do you know what the direct debits were for?
My understanding was that she had direct debit arrangements for a photography package that she had unknowingly been signed up for, and I believe she also had direct debit arrangements for a clothing retailer. She was paying off clothes that she'd purchased.
Was that clothing retailer located in your area?
I believe it was located in Katherine.
Now, you first met your client in about November last year, is that right?
Yes.
And how did you come to meet her?
I met her, at the time my colleague Penny was her principal case manager, and my colleague Penny had planned to go on annual leave, and so I was brought out to the community to meet my client as the plan was for me to take over some of the support tasks while my colleague was on leave.
And what sort of work had Penny been doing with your client?
At the time, Penny had been supporting my client to review her household budget. This was because my client had expressed some worries about being able to meet some of the essential needs that she had at the time. And so as a result of that conversation, Penny had supported my client to review her bank statement, and it became apparent to Penny at the time that my client was being charged a significant amount in ATM fees. And so one of the tasks that was assigned to me while Penny was on leave was to have a discussion with the client about seeking a fee-free bank account in order to avoid similar fees in the future.
The ATM that's in the community, do you know if that's a fee-free ATM?
I don't believe it is, and the reason for that is my understanding was that each time my client was checking her bank balance or withdrawing money from that ATM, she was charged a fee.
And that was apparent from the bank statements?
Yes.
And did Penny notice any other sorts of fees coming out of your client's account?
Yes, she also noticed dishonour and overdrawn fees being charged on that statement.
And what did the dishonour fees appear to be connected with?
I believe those dishonour fees were connected with my client's, at the time she was unable to meet some of those direct debit arrangements. I think it was in relation to the photography package that she had been signed up for, and so when she didn't have sufficient funds in her account to meet that direct debit arrangement, she was then charged a dishonour fee subsequently.
And do you know if Penny reached any views about the approximate proportion of your client's income that was going towards the payment of bank fees?
I believe we reviewed it over a period of 3 months, and from memory, on average, it was about $200 per month in fees.
And did Penny discuss with your client the possibility of switching her to a different form of bank account that didn't have those fees?
Yes, she did.
Excuse me. And this was around the time that you took over temporarily from Penny in looking after this client when she went on leave?
Yes, it was.
And Around this time, did you also have contact with your client's sister?
Yes, I did. We were also supporting my client's sister in relation to similar matters because we also reviewed my client's sister's statement and found that she was experiencing or she was being charged similar fees at the time.
Okay. So did you start looking after both your client and your client's sister after Penny went on leave?
Yes.
And when you first started having dealings with your client, did you start making notes of your interactions with her?
Yes, I did. This is a standard practice for someone in my role to take case notes about interactions that I would have with both my clients and any other relevant service providers in the course of my work with the family.
And have you exhibited those notes to your statement as Exhibit 1?
Yes, I have.
Now, having taken over as your client's caseworker on a temporary basis while Penny was away, did you start looking into potentially appropriate bank accounts for your client and her sister?
Yes, I did. I recall Penny telling me that she'd had a conversation with the client about alternative banking institutions, and during that conversation my client had identified ANZ as a bank that she was familiar with or that she had heard of because she had relatives who also banked with ANZ. So Penny and I together decided that we might do some research into ANZ to see if ANZ had a particular product that would be suitable for my client's banking needs.
And what were the results of that research?
I conducted an online research by going to the ANZ website and having a look at the transactional accounts that they had available. And after viewing the ANZ website, I could see that there were 3 transactional accounts that seemed to be available. One was the Access Advantage account, which to me appeared to be a standard transactional account with standard fees attached to it. But I also found 2 accounts that seemed to be specifically designed for eligible concession card holders, and those accounts were the Pensioner Advantage account and the Access Basic account.
And were there features of the Access Basic account that you thought rendered it a suitable product for your client and her sister?
Yes, I went on to review the, I think it was a fees and charges booklet, so an information booklet available through the website, and I was trying to do a comparison between those 2 accounts, and I could see that the Access Basic doesn't have a monthly service fee, but more importantly, it didn't seem to incur dishonour or account holders would not incur a dishonour or overdrawn fee. So based on the reading of that information booklet, or my reading of that information booklet, I deemed that the Access Basic account would be the most suitable product for my client.
And prior to Penny going on leave, did Penny go into the ANZ Bank branch in Katherine to discuss the possibility of your client and her sister opening a Access Basic account?
Yes, I believe she did. In about early December 2017, just before she went on leave, she went into the ANZ Katherine branch to ask about the Access Basic account, and yes.
And did she discuss with the banker that she had particular clients who she was making those inquiries on behalf of?
Yes, I believe she told the banker that she spoke to on that day that she had clients who didn't live in Katherine, lived in a community near Katherine, and were looking to open the Access Basic account.
Now, did Penny discuss her interaction with the banker at the bank branch with you?
Yes, after Penny returned to our office, she told me that she had gone into the Katherine ANZ branch and asked a banker there about opening an Access Basic account with a client. Penny told me that the banker on that day had told Penny that the Access Basic account was no longer available to new customers, and Penny told me that the banker instead recommended the Pensioner Advantage account as a suitable alternative for customers who are on an eligible government pension.
And after this, did you contact or attempt to contact your client to discuss these possibilities with her?
Before I did, but before I did that, I called up the ANZ call centre first, just to confirm or clarify the information that Penny had received at the Katherine branch, because at this stage I wasn't sure whether or not that information that had been provided to Penny on that day was correct. So I recall calling the ANZ call centre on that day after my conversation with Penny to ask them whether the Access Basic account was indeed an available product. And on that day I was told by the phone operator that it was available, and it was available to both new and existing ANZ customers.
And after receiving that information, did you attempt to contact your client to discuss that with her?
Yes, I attempted to contact my client. I couldn't get through to my client, but on that day I spoke to my client's sister, and I advised her that we had found a suitable product based on the discussions that we had had about what bank account they were looking for, and that we would be able to, or I would be able to support my client and her sister to come into Katherine to open that bank account.
And what was the suitable product that you were referring to in
The Access Basic account.
Thank you. And on the 19th of December last year, did you drive from Katherine to the community to pick up your client's sister to take her to Katherine to open an ANZ Access Basic account?
Yes, I did.
And can you remind us how long is the drive from Katherine to the community?
On average, it's about an hour and a half, so 90 minutes. One way.
Thank you. And was your client able to go with you that day?
My client wasn't available on that day, but my client's sister was available, so I was able to take her into Katherine with me.
And what sort of arrangements did your client or your client's sister have to make before they could leave the community to travel to Katherine?
Each time my client or my client's sister would need to come into Katherine, she would, or they would need to make babysitting arrangements to ensure that their younger children were being well looked after. And this is not always an easy task, because it's not always possible to make prior arrangements. It would normally depend on whether there are suitable relatives in the community on that day and whether they were available to look after the children. The other thing was with children who were at school, if it wasn't during school holidays, for example, and the children were at school while we go into Katherine, that would also set a time limit on how much time we can spend in Katherine before we need to start driving back to the community.
So on this day, on the 19th of December, you drove to Katherine and picked up your client's sister, is that right?
Yes.
And drove her to Katherine?
Yes.
And when you got to Katherine, did you take your client's sister to the courthouse?
Yes, I did.
Why did you take her there?
My client's sister didn't have an original copy of her birth certificate, so the first thing we did when we got to Katherine was to go to the Katherine courthouse to obtain an original copy of her birth certificate.
And having obtained that birth certificate for your client's sister, did you and your client's sister then attend the ANZ branch in Katherine?
Yes, we did.
Now, I want to ask you about what happened at the branch that day, but perhaps before I commence that piece of evidence, now might be a convenient time to break, Commissioner.
Yes, if we come back at 2.
Thank you, Commissioner.
Yes, Ms. Hall.
Ms Doe, I have been asking you questions about the events of the 19th of December last year.
Yes.
You had explained that you travelled to the community to which you've referred and collected your client's sister and brought her to Katherine.
Yes.
And that you attended the courthouse, obtained a copy of her birth certificate, and then attended on the ANZ branch at Katherine. Is that right?
Yes.
Now, what can you tell us about what happened when you went to the ANZ branch in Katherine that day?
On that day I went with my client's sister to the Katherine ANZ branch. When we got to the branch, we were greeted by the banker. At that point, I told the banker that I was there with my client's sister to support her to open an Access Basic account. At that point, the banker told me or advised me to make an appointment for my client and her sister, as it was not possible for her to open an Access Basic account without a prior appointment.
And did the bank branch appear to you to be busy at that time?
Not that I recall. I don't remember leaving the branch thinking that I had come to the branch on a particularly busy day or during a particularly busy period.
What was your reaction when you were told that you would need to return with your client on another occasion for an appointment?
I was surprised. In my own experience, I'd never had to make an appointment in order to open a bank account, and it didn't cross my mind that that would be required in order for a new customer to open a bank account at the bank branch.
Did you, as a result of that, schedule an appointment for your client and your client's sister to return to open their bank accounts?
Yes, I did. An appointment was scheduled for my client and her sister for 2 days later, on the 21st of December 2017.
And following that engagement with the banker at the branch on that day, did you then drive your client's sister back to the community an hour and a half away from Katherine?
Yes.
Now, on the 21st of December, the date of the scheduled appointments, did you again drive out to the community to collect your client and her sister?
Yes, I did.
And when you got to the community, did you make a phone call to ANZ?
Yes, I did. When I got to the community and saw my client and her sister, I had a discussion with my client and her sister about the identification documents and supporting documentation that they had with them. My client was unable to obtain her Medicare card, and so at that stage my client and her sister, each of them had a copy of their birth certificate and their Centrelink income statement. At this point I decided to call the Katherine ANZ branch from the community in order to confirm that my client and her sister had sufficient supporting documentation in order to open a new bank account that day.
And what were you told in that call?
During that call I spoke to the banker, and I advised the banker that of the documentation that my client and her sister had on that day, and I was advised by the banker that those documents would be sufficient to open a new bank account.
And then did you drive your client and your client's sister to Katherine?
Yes, I did.
And during that drive, did your client or your client's sister ask for your assistance at the meeting that was to happen at ANZ that day?
Yes, they did. We had a discussion during the drive about what that appointment was about, which was to open a new bank account for my client and her sister. I asked my client and her sister what kind of support they were wanting from me during that appointment, and my client and her sister asked if I could sit in on that appointment and support them to understand the conversation that would take place, and I believe this was because English is not my client or her sister's first language.
Now, did you attend the appointment at the bank that day with your client and her sister?
Yes.
And what do you recall about that meeting at the bank that day, Ms. Doe?
When we arrived at the branch, we were greeted by the banker for our scheduled appointment. When we sat down, I said to the banker on behalf of my client and her sister that my client and her sister were there to open an Access Basic account.
Did you explain to the banker why your client and her sister wanted to open an Access Basic account?
Yes, I did. I explained to the banker that the reason why my client and her sister were looking for the to open the Access Basic account was that they were looking for a fee-free account, and a fee-free account, particularly one that doesn't attract dishonour or overdrawn fees.
And did your client and her sister provide the banker with their identification documentation?
Yes, they did. From what I recall, my client provided her original birth certificate and a copy of her Centrelink income statement. And from memory, I believe my client's sister provided her birth certificate, her Centrelink income statement, and her Centrelink healthcare card.
Now, did you also tell the banker that your client and her sister wanted to open a savings account?
Yes, I did. I told the banker that my client and her sister were looking to open a savings account, and the banker advised that the Progress Saver savings account would be the most suitable option for them.
Now, did the banker ask your client and her sister some questions in this meeting?
Yes, she did. I believe these questions were in relation to the Progress Saver account, and these questions from memory were in relation to their household budget and in relation to their regular expenditures.
And how did your client and your client's sister go with answering those questions?
I recall some of the questions that were being asked were, what are you saving for? What amount would you like to save? How quickly would you like to save that amount? And from memory, my client appeared to be, she was giving what seemed to me to be quite vague and brief responses to those questions.
Did you form any view about her understanding of those questions?
At this point, I wasn't sure whether she understood the purposes or the implications of the questions that she was trying to answer. Because she was giving quite brief and vague responses, I was concerned that she was perhaps answering those questions to be polite because a question was being posed, and I wasn't sure whether those answers were then in turn being taken literally by the banker, and I wasn't sure whether my client was meaning them to be literal responses to those questions, as I wasn't sure whether she understood what the questions were referring to.
Do you remember any of the sorts of answers that your client or her sister were giving to those questions?
I remember when the banker asked, what are you saving for? I remember my client pausing, and I think her response was something like, maybe furniture. I remember then the banker responded by asking, how much would you like to save for furniture? I remember my client pausing and then saying something like, maybe a few thousand. I then recall the banker responding to that answer by saying something along the lines of, so let's say 5,000.
What was the banker doing during the period where these questions were being asked and the answers were being given?
The banker was typing, so I assumed that she may have been inputting those responses into her computer.
And did the banker suggest that a direct debit arrangement be set up?
Yes, at the end of those questions and after my client had provided some responses to those questions, the banker seemed to type into, I couldn't see clearly what was on the screen. I made an assumption that maybe it was some sort of calculator that was on the screen, because it appeared to me that the banker was perhaps following some prompts on that screen. And at the end of the questions, the banker said to my client that there was a suggestion made by the banker that perhaps my client should save approximately $100 per fortnight, and that the banker then suggested that she could set up a direct debit arrangement for my client, which I understood to mean that $100 per fortnight would be directly would go directly from her Centrelink payments into her Progress Saver account.
What did you think of that suggestion of the banker's?
At this point, I was quite concerned because, firstly, the whole reason why we were supporting my client and her sister to seek a fee-free account was that direct debit arrangements had caused a lot of strife for my client and her sister in the past, and we were trying to avoid putting in place direct debit arrangements that my client and her sister didn't fully understand the implications of.
Did you raise any of that with the banker?
Yes, I did. I, at this point, suggested to the banker that perhaps I wasn't sure whether my client understood what was happening in that conversation and the implications of that direct debit arrangement. I suggested to the banker that perhaps to that time to that idea later on if that's in fact what she wanted to put in place.
How were things left about the direct debit proposal?
The banker then said that that client to not put a direct could return to it later on.
And during
Yes, she did.
And what do you recall about how that process was undertaken?
My understanding was in order to set up online banking for my client and her sister, we had to go through a process of setting security questions and answers. So through that process, there were a series of, I believe, preset questions that were posed as options for my client to choose from, and then to then nominate an appropriate answer to that question.
And do you recall any of the preset questions that were suggested to your client by the banker?
Yes, I do. From memory, some of the questions were, who was your childhood hero? Who was your best friend in primary school? and I believe another one was in which town or city was your first job?
And did your client and her sister appear to understand and engage with those forms of questions?
From what I could see, my client seemed a little bit confused. She didn't immediately answer. She was processing what was being asked of her. At one stage, she turned to me and said to me, "Is it okay if I just give my mum's name or if I just give my children's names?"
So were preset questions set into the internet banking access?
Yes, they were.
Yes, in line with what your client had suggested the questions should be?
Yes, there were, I believe, 3 questions set for each person, so for my client and for her sister.
Now, were there discussions in this appointment about whether your clients did any online shopping?
From memory, I believe there may have been a question along the lines of, "Do you do any online shopping?" And from memory, my client's response.
Do you recall any discussion of any credit card being made available to your client or your client's sister?
No, I don't recall the words credit card being used in that meeting.
Do you recall any discussion about any other type of card being made available?
No, for the duration of that meeting, I was under the impression that an Access Basic account was being opened for my client and her sister, and that was because that was the account that we had requested at the beginning of the appointment.
Did you understand that there would be a key card associated with that account once it was set up?
Yes.
And do you recall any discussion about the colour of that key card?
I recall towards the end of the appointment, the banker turned her screen towards my client and her sister, and I believe there was a question as to what colour she wanted her key card to be, and I believe my client chose pink.
You've mentioned a point when the banker turned the computer monitor to you. Was there an earlier point in the meeting where that happened as well?
That was the first point that the monitor was turned around from memory, and then there was another point at the end of the appointment where the monitor was turned around again for me and my client and her sister to review what was on the screen.
And what did you see when you were given the opportunity to review what was on the screen?
I could see 2 accounts listed on that screen, and it was my understanding that those were the 2 accounts that had been opened during that appointment. The first account was the Progress Saver account, and the second account listed on the screen was an Access Advantage account.
An Access Advantage account?
Yes.
And did you say anything to the banker when you realised that there was a Progress Saver account and an Access Advantage account but no Access Basic account?
Yes, I did. I asked the banker why, I asked the banker that I've noticed that there's an Access Advantage account on the screen. Is that the account that's been opened for my client and her sister? And the banker said yes. At that point, I recall asking her or expressing confusion about why that was the account that was open, because we hadn't discussed that account during that meeting, and again we had explicitly requested that the Access Basic account be opened at the beginning of the appointment.
Did the banker say anything to you about why that form of account had been opened?
From memory, when I asked her why it wasn't an Access Basic account that was opened, the banker told me that it was not possible to open that bank account type, being the Access Basic account, from the branch.
From the branch. And was that consistent with the information that you'd obtained previously online and on the phone about this form of account?
No, it was not, and I pointed that out to the banker. I said to her that I had spoken to, I had called the ANZ call centre, and I had also reviewed the webpage for the Access Basic account on the ANZ website, and I remember telling her that that's not the information that I gathered from both the website and through the call centre.
Did they say anything to you about whether you needed to be a new or existing customer to open that form of account?
No, not from memory. All that I can recall the banker saying was that it's not possible for me to open that bank account from the branch, or that the computer system doesn't allow me to do that from the branch.
And what was the response of the banker when you explained what you had been told over the phone and what you had seen online?
I don't recall any other response beyond the banker saying that it's not possible for me to open this bank account from the branch.
Did you ask for some more information about the Access Advantage account?
Yes, I did. I remember reading about the Access Advantage account when I was reviewing the information booklet when I did online research about the ANZ products. So I remember asking the banker whether the Access Advantage account attracts a monthly service fee, and the banker told me that it does, but that she could waive them.
And did you ask about whether any dishonour or overdrawn fees applied to that form of account?
Yes, I did.
And what did the banker say to that?
The banker said to me that the account does attract dishonour and overdrawn fees, but that they shouldn't be an issue so long as the customer doesn't overdraw her account.
So how long had the meeting been going at this point, do you think, Ms Doe?
By this point, I believe the meeting had gone on for about 60 to 90 minutes.
And how were your client and her sister coping with the meeting by this point?
I think by this point they appeared to me to be quite tired, and I wasn't sure towards the end of the appointment whether my client and her sister really understood the content of the exchange between me and the banker, and I wondered whether this was because my client and her sister and myself were under the impression that it would be a fairly quick appointment because we were there to do what I thought was a fairly basic task, which was to open a bank account. So at this point, I believe my client and her sister seemed quite tired and confused.
And did you try to clarify further with the banker the forms of account that had been opened?
Yes, I did. I tried, again, I think all I could really think to ask was, can we open an Access Basic account? But at that point, I believe the banker couldn't assist me further because her next appointment had arrived, or had seemed to arrive at the bank.
So how was the meeting concluded?
At that point, we knew that the Progress Saver account was opened and an Access Advantage account had been opened. I was very confused as to why this was the case, but we just had to leave the branch because it didn't seem like the banker was able to assist us further on that day. But also my client and her sister had to do a few other things in Katherine before I drove them back to the community.
And did your client and her sister give consent to the banker for an email to be sent to your work email address to confirm the new accounts?
Yes, they did, and this was because my client and her sister do not have email accounts, and it was an email account was required through the process of opening that bank account or those bank accounts, and the banker then asked for my email address, when my client and her sister gave permission for me to provide that to the bank.
After the meeting, you said that your client had some other things to do in Katherine, is that right?
Yes.
And while your client was doing that, did you telephone ANZ?
Yes, I did. I called up the call centre again and I explained, without identifying my client or her sister, what had just happened at the ANZ Katherine branch, and I again asked whether it was true that the Access Basic account is available both to new and existing customers, and the ANZ operator or representative told me that it is an available product and it's available to both new and existing customers as long as the customer can provide suitable identification and supporting documentation at a local branch.
And after this call, did you go back to the ANZ branch?
Yes, I did.
And why did you do that?
I went back into the branch to ensure that the branch had kept photocopies of my client's identification documents, just to ensure that that wouldn't be a barrier to my client and her sister being able to access the Access Basic account. During my phone call with the ANZ representative, I also asked whether it was possible for my client and her sister to now change their account type over the phone, and the operator told me that it is possible now that they've already provided sufficient documentation to a local branch, and that's why after that phone call ended, I went back to the branch to ensure that the branch had in fact kept photocopies of those documents.
And after this, did you drive your client and her sister the 1.5 hours back to their community outside of Katherine?
Yes, I did.
So those events were on the 21st of December last year?
Yes.
and in the new year, on the 4th of January, did you go back out to the community?
Yes, I did.
And did you meet with your client?
Yes.
And did you show your client how to use the ANZ online banking system?
Yes, I did.
And up until that point, how had your client normally got information about her bank account?
My client told me that she would call the bank to check her balance.
And at this point, had your client received the key card for the new
I
accounts?
don't believe so.
Had she been able to access her new accounts?
I don't believe so.
Was she still using her pre-existing bank account with a different bank for the receipt of her Centrelink benefits?
Yes.
And at some later point, did your client receive the key card that would allow her to access the new ANZ accounts?
Yes.
Now, on that day, on the 4th of January, when you were in the community with your client, did you log on with your client to the internet banking service?
Yes, I did. My client happened to have some data on her mobile phone on that day, so I thought it might be a good time to show her how to access her online banking account, should she wish to do that herself at a later time.
And when you logged on to her online banking, what did you see about the sorts of accounts that had been set up?
When we logged in on that day, I recall seeing 2 accounts in her online banking account. There was the Progress Saver account, and then there was a Pensioner Advantage account that was listed.
A Pensioner Advantage account?
Yes.
Did you comment to your client about seeing that there was a different form of account, a Pensioner Advantage account?
Yes, at that point I thought I was surprised because I wasn't sure why it was listed there, or that there was an account that was listed as a Pension Advantage account, because I don't recall supporting my client to open that type of account. So I recall asking my client whether she had made contact with ANZ to change her account type, and she told me that she hadn't.
And what did you think when you saw that there was a different type of account but still not an Access Basic account there for your client?
I think by that point I was just very confused, because I couldn't think of an explanation as to why that account would appear on my client's account. Yeah.
So a bit over a month after that, on the 15th of February this year, did your colleague Penny, having come back from leave, go out to the community to pick up your client for some other appointments?
Yes.
And those other appointments were in Katherine?
Yes.
And while your client was in Katherine, did you meet up with her and call ANZ?
Yes.
And what do you recall about that call?
My client and I had called ANZ with the intention of changing her account type over the phone. On that day, we called ANZ twice. The first time I supported my client to call the ANZ call centre, I explained to the operator that we had called for my client to change her account type from the now Pension Advantage account to the Access Basic account. During that first phone call, the operator advised that it was not possible for us to do this over the phone and that we needed to attend a bank branch.
Did you then call ANZ a second time that day?
Yes, I did. During that first phone call, I don't remember following any prompts at the beginning of the call to enter my client's specific account details, and so I decided to call ANZ back a second time, and this time my client entered her account details, and I believe we were then directed to the personal banking team.
When you were directed to a personal banking team, did you again ask to change the Pensioner Advantage account to an Access Basic account?
Yes, the second time we called, when we got through to the personal banking team, I spoke with a representative named Jenny. I explained to Jenny that my client was calling to change her account type from the Pension Advantage account to the Access Basic account. Jenny told me that this would be possible, and she then proceeded to talk with my client in order to verify her identity over the phone.
And what happened after that?
At that point, Jenny told my client and me that it was not possible to change her account type over the phone on that day, and this was because my client had failed to verify her identity using a verbal password on a previous occasion.
And did she tell you that there was some other way that you could try and change your client's account from the Pensioner Advantage account to the Access Basic account?
Jenny suggested, because my client had reportedly failed to verify her identity over the phone on a previous occasion, we were told that my client needed to verify her identity again at a branch before she could have her account type changed.
And could your client go to the branch that day in Katherine?
We were planning to, and so Jenny suggested to us that we go to the branch and supply her documents again and have her identity re-verified. And so at that point, I recall asking Jenny to place me on hold and call the Katherine branch to let them know that we were coming. So she did that, she placed me on hold, and then when she came back to the call, she told me that the Katherine ANZ branch was closed on that day due to an unexpected plumbing issue.
How were you and your client feeling by this point about your experiences in trying to open this account?
I think by this point we were both quite frustrated and very confused because, again, it never crossed my mind that it would take that much time to open a bank account. And so at this point we decided that we needed to provide formal feedback about the experience that my client had had so far.
So did you and your client in that second phone call to ANZ on that day make a formal complaint?
Yes, I provided, or I made a formal complaint. I requested that Jenny transfer me to the complaints department, and Jenny did so. I then spoke to an operator, I believe his name was Josh, and on behalf of my client, I provided a formal complaint about the experience.
What were you told about what would happen with that complaint?
I remember Josh taking down, I believe he was taking down my feedback. At the end of that, I asked him what the follow-up process would be. Josh told me that it would be an internal process and that an email would be sent to the Katherine branch. I believe I then asked Josh whether my client could expect to have a follow-up phone call or any follow-up in relation to her feedback. I believe Josh said that he could have a letter sent out to my client to confirm that ANZ had received her feedback.
Now, that was the 15th of February. On the 1st of March this year, now some 3 months after the decision was made to attempt to open an ANZ Access Basic account, did you and your client again go to the Katherine ANZ branch together?
Yes, we did. My client was transported into Katherine by another service provider, and when I met with her, we decided that this was a good opportunity for us to go to the Katherine branch in order for my client to have her identity re-verified, and so that she could then create a new verbal password. So that's what we did on that day.
Did you see the same banker that day?
Yes, we did. When we got to the branch, I explained to the banker that my client had needed to create a new verbal password and she needed to have her identity re-verified, and the banker did that, and the banker supported my client to create a new verbal password.
So having re-verified your client's identity, did you then attempt again to change your client's account to the ANZ Access Basic account?
Yes, I did. I recall during my phone conversation on the 15th of February with Jenny, I recall Jenny saying that once your client re-verifies her identity, she should be able to change her bank account type at the branch. So on the 1st of March, when we had a new verbal password created and had her identity re-verified, I then thought, we're already at the branch, I'll ask the banker whether she can change my client's account type from the Pension Advantage account to the Access Basic account.
And were you able to do that?
No.
Why not? What was said to you about why you couldn't do that?
I recall the banker, she was typing as I was, when I asked her to change, if it was possible to change the account type, and after the banker seemed to type into her computer, she again said, the system is not allowing me to change her account type from the branch.
During this meeting, was there also a discussion about dishonour fees?
Yes, after the banker told my client and me that it was not possible for her to change the account type at the branch, she then told my client that my client was doing very well, or doing well, because it does not appear that my client has been charged any dishonour or overdrawn fees.
How did you feel about that statement from the banker to your client?
I think I took it as a dismissive response from the banker to my client's request to change her account type, because to me that seemed to suggest that because my client was seemingly doing well according to the banker, that it was not necessary to then respond to her request to change her account type to an Access Basic account.
Now, having re-verified your client's identity, after you left the bank that day, did you try and deal with this by telephone with ANZ again?
Yes, I did. I recall Jenny, the ANZ bank representative, telling me that if there were any issues that I could call the personal banking team back on a particular phone number. So after we left the Katherine branch, that's what I did.
And what do you recall of that call?
I recall speaking to a male operator. I can't recall his name, but I remember telling him, explaining the situation again, that my client has now re-verified her identity and that she wishes to change her account type from the Pension Advantage account to the Access Basic account.
And were you able to change your client's account to the Access Basic account in this telephone call, Ms. Doe?
No, we were not. The representative told me that it was not possible for my client to change from a Pension Advantage account to an Access Basic account. The operator told me that it was possible to change from a Access Basic account to the Pension Advantage account, but not the other way around.
Was the operator able to create an additional account for your client, a new Access Basic account?
Yes, he was. I recall on that occasion, by this point, I was getting quite frustrated, and so I explained to the operator that my client simply wants to access an Access Basic account, so is there anything that you can do to support my client to access that account? And so the operator, I recall him saying that because my client had already supplied her documentation to a local branch, that he could simply create a third account or an additional account, being the Access Basic account, for her on that day.
And what did the operator say your client needed to do after this call in relation to that new account?
After he created the Access Basic account for my client, the operator told me that in order for my client to have an access card or a key card sent out to her, she needed to send a text message to a number, and that text message needed to come from her phone, and that text message was to include a message along the lines of, "I request a new key card for my Access Basic account."
Now, after that call, did your client send a text message along those lines to the bank?
No, she wasn't able to on that occasion because she didn't have phone credit on that day.
Have you experienced other situations with other clients, Ms. Doe, in which a bank has asked your client to send a text message to facilitate the opening of or access to an account?
No, in my experience, I've never had a client who has been requested to communicate with a bank via text message. I have had experiences where the bank might send a security code or a passcode to a phone number, but in my experience, I've never had a client be asked to send a text message to the bank.
So what was the situation by the end of this call in terms of the accounts that your client now had?
By the end of that phone conversation, my client had a Progress Saver account. She had a Pension Advantage account, which carried with it a very high risk of attracting dishonour and overdrawn fees. And she also had an Access Basic account, which she couldn't access because she wasn't able to officially request a new key card for it in the way that had been suggested by the bank operator on that day.
Around this time, did you decide to try and seek some external assistance?
Yes, I did. At this point, because it was taking so long to complete what I thought would be a very simple task, I began to do some online research, specifically on the ASIC website, just to see if there was someone that we could speak to seek some advice from or some guidance from.
And as a result of that research, did you contact ASIC's Indigenous Outreach Program?
Yes, I did. I believe I called them in early March. I wasn't able to get through to anyone on that day, but I did leave a voicemail for someone to call me back.
And did you subsequently speak to someone from the program?
Yes, I did. On the 20th of March, a representative from that program called me back, and I gave a verbal outline of my client's experience in trying to open an Access Basic account with ANZ, and the worker from ASIC then asked me if it was possible for me to provide that feedback in writing.
And did you provide the Indigenous Outreach Program at ASIC with the document that you've annexed to your statement?
Yes, I did.
Now, a few weeks ago, were you contacted by someone from ANZ?
Yes, a few weeks ago, a woman named Emma from ANZ's Complaints Department gave me a call and said that she was calling me to follow up with my client and in relation to some feedback that I had provided about my client's experience.
And did you discuss with Emma whether your client could get a key card for the Access Basic account that had been set up in that last call?
Yes, I did. We were trying to work out what would be the best solution for my client at this point, and I believe through that conversation there were two options that we were exploring. One was to have her Pension Advantage account simply changed to an Access Basic account, or two was to have an access card sent out to my client so she could access her Access Basic account and have a Pension Advantage account, closed.
Now, were you told in this discussion with Emma that you would need a written authority from your client in order to represent her further in these conversations?
Yes.
And did it take some time for you to be able to obtain that written authority from your client?
Yes, I believe it took a week or possibly more than that, mainly because it often takes time for us to work out when we can get out to the community, but also my client and her sister had a number of other issues that they had to deal with more urgently during that period.
And on the 27th of June, were you able to obtain from your client a signed written authority for you to communicate with ANZ on her behalf?
Yes, I was.
And did you email that to ANZ?
Yes, I did.
And have you received further correspondence from ANZ in relation to the delivery of a key card to your client?
Yes, I have. I recall Emma had sent replied to my email with a letter from ANZ, and that letter requested some more information from my client as to whether she would like to pick up the card from the Katherine branch, I believe, or whether she would like that card to be mailed out to her.
Do you understand that that card has now very recently been mailed out to your client?
Yes, I last spoke to Emma on Tuesday, and my understanding is that that card is being couriered out to my client, and that Emma was hoping that the card would arrive at my client's house by Wednesday, so yesterday. But I haven't had contact with my client, so I can't confirm whether she has received her card.
Are you aware of whether your client will need to activate the key card once she receives it?
Yes, Emma advised me during our phone conversation that my client would then need to call ANZ, and that all calls in relation to my client's accounts would then be forwarded to her or directed to her, and that then Emma would then have to ask my client a series of questions in order to verify her identity, in order to then have her card activated.
So to the best of your knowledge, has your client been able to access the Access Basic account yet?
No.
So from what you've outlined, Ms. Doe, it appears that it took about 4 months for you to assist your client to open a fee-free account with ANZ, despite eligibility from the outset. What can you say about your experience in trying to open that account over that period of time for your client?
I think it's been a very long, confusing, frustrating process. Like I've said before, it never crossed my mind that it would be this difficult to open a bank account. The last time I opened a bank account for myself, it took me 2 minutes, and I did it on my laptop. And so I think through this experience suggests to me that there are particular cultural, language, geographical barriers that are experienced by Indigenous consumers in and around Katherine that perhaps weren't taken into consideration by ANZ staff members.
And how do you think your client would have fared in setting up a bank account without your assistance?
Well, given that she hasn't had much success with my assistance, I'm not sure.
Thank you, Ms. Doe. I have no further questions.
Ms. Williams.
Thank you, Commissioner. Ms. Doe, my name is Williams and I represent ANZ. Now, You say in paragraph 7 of your statement that you first came into contact with your client because your colleague Penny was going on leave and so handed over a number of her clients to you temporarily.
Yeah.
And was it still the case at the time of your appointment with ANZ on the 21st of December that you were looking after a number of Penny's clients?
Yes.
Including the client to whom you refer in this statement?
Yes.
And so you had a heavier workload than usual, obviously, as a result of that?
No, I actually didn't. At that point, there were kind of external factors that were affecting the referral pathways into our program. So at that point, I was looking after 2 families.
I see. And for those families you were looking after, were you not just financial matters, but providing the kind of support you referred to earlier in your evidence, parental capability and those sort of matters?
Yes.
Yes. And this appointment on the 21st of December was just one interaction that you had in the context of doing that other work for those 2 families?
Yes.
And it's difficult after the event, isn't it, to recall precisely what was said during that appointment, which you've told us went for an hour and a half approximately.
Well, I don't have a transcript of the interaction that I had on that day, but I would have been I did take notes, some notes during the meeting, and then I would have written a more expanded version of my notes after the meeting. So to the best of my recollection, I would be referring to the notes that I've made, and which is what I've done throughout this for the statement that I've provided to the Commission today.
Yes, I see. But despite having made notes, it's difficult to recall, isn't it, all of the details relating to the meeting and your representation of your client at this time?
I think I would say it would be difficult to recall every single word that was said throughout the 90 minutes, but I would recall the important details that would pertain to the support that I was seeking to provide to my client on that day.
I see. And Ms Doe, you say in paragraph 5 of your statement that your client was not employed at the time of the events in question.
Yes.
Do you, in your feedback document that you provided to ASIC, which is Exhibit 1 to your statement, you say on the final page of that document that, and in fact perhaps I should take you to the very bottom of the page before that under the heading Summary. You see there a reference to the time at which your client and her sister were first transported from the community to Katherine.
Yeah.
And you say there that each trip involved 3 hours of driving time, as well as the need for your client and her sister to find babysitters and also to take time off from their casual employment.
Yes, at the time my client's sister was engaged in casual employment in the community, and I believe my client, there was a possibility of her obtaining casual employment at the time, but she wasn't officially working at the time. I
see. So although this statement here gives the impression that both your client and her sister were working, in fact your client wasn't working. Is that your evidence?
I think when I was writing that feedback document, I hadn't broken down individual circumstances in relation to my client or her sister. So when I say that they had to take time off from their casual employment, I was referring to my client's sister, who was in fact engaged in casual employment, but also my client who had the possibility of obtaining some casual employment at the time.
I see. You do refer though, don't you, to both ladies having to take time off their casual employment?
I can see that that's how it reads in that document, yes.
There's not some confusion in your mind at the time you wrote that document or now as to what your client's employment status was at the time?
No, I wouldn't characterise it as confusion. I think when I'd written that feedback document under summary, I was trying to illustrate some of the barriers that were relevant for my client and her sister. And I think at this point it's also important for me to note that my client and her sister depended on each other for support. So if my client's sister had to take off time from her casual employment, the effects of that would then also flow onto my client.
I see. And I'll ask you to turn please to paragraph 30 of your statement, Ms Doe, if you would. You could look please at the part of paragraph 30 which commences at the top of page 8 of your statement. Now, you've given evidence today that from memory, the banker said that it was not possible to open an Access Basic account from the branch, and you have no memory of the banker saying that an Access Basic account couldn't be opened for new customers. You recall giving that evidence?
Sorry, could you repeat that?
You've given evidence just now, in answer to a question from Ms Orr, that the banker told you in the meeting on the 21st of December, you said from memory, the banker told you that it was not possible to open an Access Basic account from the branch.
Yes.
And you said you had no memory of the banker saying that an Access Basic account could not be opened for new customers. Do you recall giving that evidence?
I recall saying that the banker had told my client that the Access Basic account couldn't be opened from the branch. I'm sorry, I don't understand the second part of your question.
You also said in answer to a question from Senior Counsel Assisting that you had no memory of the banker saying that an Access Basic account could not be opened for new customers.
That's correct.
Yes. And the statement at the very top of page 8 of paragraph 30 of your statement, that first sentence there, you would accept in light of your evidence that's incorrect. Is that so?
Sorry, could you point me to that line again?
The very first sentence at the top of page 8 of your statement, it's part of paragraph 30.
I see. So my statement is saying that the banker had told me that the Access Basic account was not available to new customers, and...
But in fact, your evidence earlier this afternoon is that you have no memory of the banker having made a statement to that effect. What I'm putting to you, Ms Dyer, is that the statement in the first line of page 8 is incorrect. You've made a mistake there.
I can see that that's what I've written on the statement, and if I don't recall exactly what I just said to Ms Orr, so if you're saying that I had said that I don't recall that the banker had told me it was not available to new customers, then that would suggest that that particular line is incorrect. That's what you're saying.
Yes, that's what I'm putting to you, Ms Dyer.
Your junior got a transcript reference, Ms Williams. It would help me if you're putting something as precise as this to the witness. If you had a transcript reference for my...
Yes, Commissioner, we're just locating that.
Perhaps if your junior finds that,
Yes,
unless it's going to disrupt the order of your cross-examination, we might move on.
Certainly, Commissioner. Ms Doe, you also say in paragraph 30 that the banker said that she was unable to open an access account from the, I beg your pardon, an Access Basic account from the branch. I suggest that you're mistaken about that, and that the banker in fact said something to the effect that your client had said that she wanted a Visa debit card and the Access Basic account did not come with a Visa debit card.
I don't recall a conversation about debit cards taking place during that meeting. I don't recall the banker saying anything about a debit card. All I recall in terms of account types that was spoken about was when we'd first gotten to the branch, and I had told the banker on behalf of my client and her sister that we were there to open an Access Basic account. At no other point was another account type discussed with us, apart from when the banker suggested a Progress Saver account in response to my client and her sister's request to have a savings account opened for them.
But although you have no recollection of the statement that I'm putting to you, Ms Doe, I'm suggesting that in fact the banker did say to you that your client had said she wanted a Visa debit card and that an Access Basic account did not come with a Visa debit card, although you don't now recall that.
I believe if that did take place on the day, I would have included that in my notes. Again, I was under the impression for the entire meeting with the banker that an Access Basic account and a Progress Saver account was being opened. Had another account type been brought up, I would recall that conversation taking place.
So your evidence is that had another account type been discussed, you would have recalled that?
Yes.
But Ms Doe, all I'm putting to you is that the banker did not say to you that she was unable to open an Access Basic account from the branch, but rather said that because your client had said she wanted a Visa debit card, an Access Basic account did not come with a Visa debit card.
I don't believe that that's the conversation that took place, and in any case, the account that was opened for my client and her sister was an Access Advantage account, and that account was not discussed explicitly with my client or her sister or me on that day.
Ms Doe, let me I'll just pause there for a moment. Commissioner, the transcript reference is 3,999 at lines 26 to 30.
Just a moment. Three treble nine at.
I'm sorry, lines 26 to 30, Commissioner.
Yes, thank you.
And Ms Doe, you also say in paragraph 30 that the banker said to you something along the lines of, the system doesn't allow me to open that account, and I suggest to you that your memory in that respect is also mistaken, and the banker did not say that to you.
From my memory, that's what she said to me, because I recall her saying that to me more than once, and I recall thinking at the time that that didn't make any sense to me.
Ms Doe, could you turn please to paragraph 45 of your statement, where you give an account of what you say occurred at the meeting on the 1st of March 2018. Ms Doe, I suggest to you that you are mistaken in your evidence that the banker told you on that occasion that the computer would not let her open an Access Basic account from the, I withdraw that, change the account type from the branch.
From my recollection of that interaction, the banker told me two things. One, she did three things. One, she supported my client to obtain a new verbal password. Two, she said the computer system doesn't allow her to change the account type from the branch. And three, she told my client that my client was doing doing well by not incurring any overdrawn or dishonour fees.
And in relation to those, the second of those things you've mentioned, Ms Doe, I'm suggesting that your recollection is mistaken.
I don't believe my recollection is mistaken, because I recall the banker typing as I was asking her to change my client's account type, and the banker typed some things into her computer, and then she said to me, the computer is not allowing me to change it from the branch.
No further questions.
Yes, thank you, Ms Williams. Yes, Ms Hall.
Nothing further, Commissioner.
Yes, thank you very much, Ms Doe. You may step down. You're excused.
The next witness, Commissioner, is Mr Bowden. Could we have a brief adjournment before Mr Bowden comes into the witness box?
Yes, if I come back at 3.
Thank you, Commissioner.